the rats that ate the rations, imagine stepping onto the deck of a Tudor warship in the 16th century. The salt wind bites at your face, the timbers creak with the slow rhythm of the sea, and every breath tastes of damp wood and human sweat. But beneath your boots, below deck in the darkness, something else stirs, something alive, restless, and hungry. The rats, hundreds of them, sometimes thousands. They were not merely stowaways, they were competitors, adversaries, and in many ways the true rulers of the ship's lower decks. To understand how these creatures shaped the daily life and survival of Tudor sailors, you must first grasp the logistics of feeding a floating fortress. A voyage could last for months or even years. Fresh supplies were quickly consumed or spoiled. Salted beef and pork were packed into barrels, dried peas, aged cheese, and the infamous ship's biscuit-trock hard slabs of flour and water that could break a tooth became staples of survival. But even these unappetizing rations were precious. Every crumb mattered. Every scrap of sustenance was counted and guarded. Yet the rats were indifferent to human plans. They bred in the shadows, swarming the hold where the biscuit casks were, stored gnawing through rope and timber. At night, sailors lying in their hammocks would hear the soft skirring, the delicate scratching of claws against wood, and know that by morning there would be less food than before. Sometimes they could see the rats darting over their blankets or feel them brush past their skin. Bold enough to scavenge even from the personal belongings of the crew, the ship's biscuit itself was already a breeding ground for another maggots. Weevils infested the flour before it was ever baked, and after a few weeks at sea, each biscuit could be alive with wriggling larvae. So the sailors faced a grim dilemma. They could eat the biscuit as it was, crawling with insects, or they could knock it on the table to shake the maggots out if they were lucky enough that the rats hadn't found the cask first and eaten half the supply. You might think the officers had it better, but even the captain's stores were not immune. Rats climbed with ease-up ropes and into cabinets. They shredded sacks of flour, gnawed corks from wine bottles, and left their droppings everywhere. They were cunning enough to learn when the night watches were distracted and fearless, enough to scurry across the feet of sleeping men. To protect what little food remained, sailors sometimes took turns standing guard over the barrels with clubs or pikes, swatting at the rats as they came. But there were too many. No matter how many you killed, more would appear, as though conjured. From the darkness itself, the struggle against the rats was not just about hunger. It was about morale. Imagine the toll on a man's spirit to rise from his hammock, hollow-eyed from lack of sleep, and find that the few rations he'd clung to were stolen or fouled. And then to be ordered to work the rigging, haul the guns, or brace against a storm and an empty stomach, and a mind sickened by the knowledge that your food was in the bellies of vermin. The fear of starvation haunted every voyage. In times of scarcity, when the weather delayed resupply or the holds were flooded by storms, the rats thrived while the men weakened. Some diaries record sailors attempting to trap and eat the rats, themselves a grim reversal of the predator-prey relationship. Others resorted to boiling leather straps or scraping mold from barrels to create thin, revolting stews. But always, the rats returned. They came not only for the food, but for the security the ship provided, a vast wooden ark drifting through hostile seas, offering warmth, darkness, and the endless chance to feed. Disease was another deadly consequence. Rats were vectors of typhus and other fevers that could sweep through a crowded vessel in days. Sailors who had survived cannon fire and storms sometimes succumbed to illnesses that began in the filthy corners of the hold, where rats nested in old sailcloth and chewed their young free of the afterbirth. In the sickbed place, barely separated from the rest of the ship by a thin canvas sheetman, lay delirious, their bodies racked with fever, their lips cracked from dehydration. As the rats crept closer in the night, they nibbled at wounds, chewed at the bindings of the dead, and grew fat on human misery. There was no escaping the infestation. Every port brought new rats aboard. The moment the gangplanks were lowered, these opportunists streamed up the ropes and into the bowels of the ship. No matter how many were trapped, drowned, or clubbed, the population never shrank for long. The sailors developed a grim sort of acceptance. Some joked that the rats were the real crew, that the men were merely their reluctant hosts. Others found a kind of defiance, vowing to keep their rations safe if it was the last thing they did. But no matter how they coped, The daily battle against the rats became as much a part of naval life as the discipline of the boatswain's whistle or the roar of the cannons. These moments, though often omitted from the grand accounts of naval warfare and exploration, revealed the raw, unvarnished truth of seafaring life in the Tudor era. It was not only the enemy without that threatened survival, but the relentless enemy within the thousands of tiny mouths forever gnawing at the edges of endurance. When you read about grand voyages, about ships braving the unknown to chart new worlds, remember that history often forgets the quieter battles. The victories against the rats were never final, never glorious, but they were battles nonetheless, in the darkness, with broom handles and desperation, by men who knew that their survival rested on winning a war against creatures they could never fully conquer. The toothless crew of the Mary Rose imagine. You are standing on the deck of the Mary Rose in the summer of 1545, the salty winds of the Solent whip across your face, carrying the unmistakable stench of tar, sweat, and something far worse, the smell of decay rising from the mouths of your fellow sailors. The ship itself was the pride of King Henry VIII's navy, an enormous carrack, bristling with bronze cannons and packed with over 400 men preparing to confront the French fleet. But behind this display of power lay a hidden, slow-moving disaster. The rotting of men from within, the silent collapse of bodies starved of the simplest nutrients, and the cruel transformation of teeth into stumps and gums into festering wounds. This is the story of the toothless crew of the Mary Rose sailors, who, long before cannon fire sent them to the bottom, were already prisoners of scurvy, bad diet, and a system that valued firepower over human welfare. To understand how these men ended up in such pitiful condition, you have to look deeper than the battlefield. The Tudor diet at sea was essentially a sentence to slow malnutrition. Rations were rigidly calculated for caloric bulk, not nutritional value. The men lived on salted beef and pork, so heavily cured it was often indistinguishable from leather. Ship's biscuit heart tack-formed the rest of the diet. It was made of wheat, flour, water, and nothing else. When baked, it resembled something between a brick and a stone. Stored in barrels, these biscuits could last for years, but frequently became infested with weevils and maggots. They provided no vitamin C. When the men were fortunate, they received dried peas or occasional cheese. But even that paltry variation did little to stop the slow disintegration of their mouths and bodies. The impact was gruesome. Scurvy begins invisibly. At first, men felt fatigue and aching in the legs and lower back. As days passed, their gums became swollen and purple. Small cuts refused to heal. Bruises appeared where none should be. Teeth loosened as the flesh receded. Sailors were known to spit out clots of gum tissue, along with blood, a daily horror they could neither prevent nor explain. In an age before the germ theory or nutritional science, the link between fresh produce and health was simply not understood. They called it land sickness or the scurvy, but no one had a cure. All they could do was watch as their comrades' jaws blackened and their breath turned fetid enough to make even the hardened turn away. Some men grew so desperate that they tried to chew on rope fibers or bits of leather in the hope it would strengthen their teeth. It never worked. When the Mary Rose sank during battle, hundreds of bodies were trapped below decks. The wreck lay undisturbed for centuries, preserving not just the timbers of the ship, but the skeletal evidence of this dietary catastrophe. Modern archaeologists recovered the remains of about 179 individuals. Forensic examination revealed unmistakable signs of scurvy and severe oral disease. Skulls were missing entire sets of teeth. The jawbones were riddled with abscess cavities. Some sailors' dental arches had collapsed entirely, leaving them unable to chew even the meager rations they were given. In life, this meant chronic pain and weakness. In death, it left a silent testimony. The empire's might was built on men who were being slowly dismantled by their own food. The irony is almost too sharp to bear. The Mary Rose was a floating arsenal, equipped with more than 90 guns designed to obliterate enemies in a single broadside. Its design was at the cutting edge of naval warfare. Yet, in all the careful planning, no one thought to supply a reliable source of citrus or fresh greens, even when lemons and limes were known in the Mediterranean. The logistical knowledge and, perhaps, the will was not there to provision them in English fleets. so the men who fired those great cannons and hoisted the sails were simultaneously eroding from within. Some historians believe that weakened, malnourished sailors were less able to respond to emergencies, contributing to the disaster when the ship began to heel over. Imagine the chaos. Men whose limbs ached with the effort of moving, whose gums bled with every shout, now trying to escape flooding compartments filled with powder, timber, and the weight of their own exhaustion. It is tempting to romanticize Tudor sailors as hardy adventurers, but the reality was often more grim. You were more likely to die of disease and hunger than of enemy action. Scurvy was a silent killer, sapping morale, strength, and the will to endure. It is no wonder that when you look at the preserved skulls of the Mary Rose, you see in their toothless jaws the same story repeated over and over: men who had been eaten alive by their own diet. In the centuries that followed, navies slowly learned that lemons and limes could keep scurvy at bay. By the late 18th century, the British Navy finally institutionalized citrus rations, earning sailors the nickname limeys. Revelation came far too late for the crew entombed in the Solent's muddy floor. The image of those empty mouths is haunting because it reveals something deeper than disease. It shows a civilization that could build great ships, but could not yet grasp the fundamentals of human sustenance. It shows a navy that measured success in cannon shot and broadside power, but neglected the simple, invisible war raging inside each sailor's body. And it shows that no matter how mighty a ship, no matter how vast its armament, a crew deprived of vitamins was ultimately as fragile as any drifting piece of wreckage. So the next time you see the salvaged remains of the Mary Rose in its museum cradle, remember the story beneath the timbers. Imagine the sailor who woke each day with a mouth full of pain, who struggled to chew the same unchanging rations, who tried to do his duty knowing that he was weakening by the hour. Picture the decks filled with men whose teeth were falling. Out as the ship they trusted to keep them alive carried them to a fate that had begun not in battle, but in the kitchen barrel. It is a story of neglect as much as of braveria. Reminder that the true enemies of sailors were often the ones they brought aboard themselves: ignorance, indifference, and the slow rot of the human body when it is starved of what it needs most. This is why the Mary Rose's toothless crew still speak to us across nearly 5 centuries. They warn us that the tools of conquest can never replace the necessities of life. They show that beneath the flags and cannons and royal decrees, there were ordinary men whose health was sacrificed silently and pitilessly in pursuit of empire. Their story is not just a footnote in naval history. It is a testament to the cost of forgetting that human bodies have limits, and that even the most formidable warship is only as strong as the mouths it feeds. The cannons that exploded in the brutal age of naval warfare when kingdoms gambled their futures upon the decks of wooden ships. Few weapons inspired as much ourned, as much terrors, the cannon. To modern minds, cannons conjure images of thundering power, the great equalizers that could sink a ship or shatter a fortress wall. But what is less often remembered is how these mighty instruments were, in their earliest forms, as much a threat to their masters as to their enemies. During the 16th and 17th centuries, when the art of casting bronze and iron cannon was still being perfected, entire crews sometimes perished not under enemy fire, but by the catastrophic failure of their own guns. Imagine a ship rolling in the swell, the air thick with powder smoke. The gunners are bare-chested, slick with sweat, their palms calloused from hauling the heavy shot and tamping the charge into the dark bore of a cannon that might have been cast years before. In a foundry where quality control was more a matter of luck than of science. Each time a cannon fired, it was an act of faith that the breech would hold. Because a cannon was little more than an enormous sealed tube, it required a perfect balance between strength and the pressure of the exploding powder charge. But in an era when metallurgical impurities were common, a hidden air bubble or a hairline fracture in the casting could be a death sentence. In the heat of battle, with adrenaline surging and the decks slick with blood and sea spray, crews often fired as quickly as possible, sometimes reloading before the barrel had cooled. The iron or bronze would expand, microscopic cracks growing larger with each shot. When the metal finally gave way, it erupted outward in a storm of jagged shrapnel. Gunners standing closest were frequently dismembered instantly. Those further away were impaled by flying shards or burned by ignited powder. On ships where space was confined, the explosion could trigger fires that raced across decks piled high with spare powder charges and oiled rope. The English Navy, which invested heavily in cannonry during the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, witnessed numerous such tragedies. One documented case in the late 1500s describes a gunner aboard an English galleon who had overseen dozens of battles without mishap. On a day of clear weather and favorable winds, his cannon split apart. On its fourth shot, witnesses reported that the barrel burst as a thunderclap, tearing open the starboard side of the deck and sending splinters into men 20 feet away. The gunner himself was obliterated. No body remained to bury. In another engagement, a cannon aboard the Mary Rose, Henry VIII's flagship, is believed to have exploded during an exchange with French ships. While the exact cause of the Mary Rose's sinking remains debated, many blame sudden flooding when she heeled. Overwitnesses described a violent blast shortly before she capsized. Such incidents reveal how the fear of cannon failure was woven into a gun crew's daily reality. A gunner's mate often tested cannons by tapping the barrel with a brass hammer, listening for an off-pitch ring that might suggest a flaw, but even this was far from foolproof. Sometimes, the flaw was so deep inside the metal that no inspection could reveal it until the moment of disaster. The pressure produced by igniting black powder was immense, driving the projectile forward, with a force that could fracture bone if the recoil was not perfectly managed. To absorb this energy, cannons were lashed down with thick ropes and braced by heavy wooden blocks. But when the barrel burst, the restraints only served to anchor the gun as the metal split into lethal fragments. After a cannon burst, the aftermath was ghastly. A deck that moments before had been crowded with men was transformed into a scene of ruin. Blood and burned flesh mingled with the acrid reek of powder smoke. Survivors scrambled to extinguish fires, tend to the wounded, and brace for enemy volleys that might follow. Gunners who survived might face questioning under suspicion. They had overloaded the charge or failed to maintain their weapon properly, in which human error and technological limits collided with tragic frequency. The process of cannon casting itself was a long and perilous undertaking. Molten bronze had to be poured carefully into molds made of clay or sand. A single slip in temperature control or a contaminant in the alloy could create hidden weaknesses. Once cooled, the barrel was bored smooth, but even this step could cause micro cracks. In Northern Europe, iron cannon eventually replaced bronze. For many applications, largely because iron was cheaper, but iron guns were even more brittle and prone to failure. These were the weapons that armed Tudor warships, Spanish galleons, and Dutch men-of-war. They were symbols of imperial ambition, but also of how thin the line was between triumph and catastrophe. To the men who served them, cannons were necessary evil tools of power that demanded sacrifice. Gunners knew the risk every time they rammed home the charge and prepared the slow match. They had seen what a bursting cannon did to flesh and bone, and yet in the chaos of naval combat, they could not hesitate. Each shot had to be fired, each target engaged, or the ship itself might be overrun. Some historians argue that the unpredictability of early cannon technology shaped naval tactics as much as any strategic doctrine. Captains sometimes held back their broadsides, not out of caution for the enemy, but fear of what their own guns might do. Others adopted firing sequences that allowed barrels time to cool, reducing the risk of failure, but also slowing the rate of fire, sometimes fatally so. The cannon that exploded mid-battle stands as a grim testament to the price of innovation in an age when metallurgy had yet to catch up with ambition. These weapons transformed warfare, but in their infancy, they were as hazardous to their wielders as to their foes. It is easy to romanticize the image of a ship in full broadside, the thunder rolling across the waves, but beneath that spectacle lay a truth far more sobering. Every gun crew lived with the knowledge that the next shot could be their last, not because of any enemy shot, but because the cannon itself might betray them in the most violent way imaginable. The surgeon, who used a mallet, imagined the rolling deck of a Tudor warship pitched in the middle of a roaring sea battle. Cannon blasts and the shriek of splintered timber fill the air, while smoke curls through the cramped wooden passageways. Below deck, now picture a makeshift surgical theater. Rough wooden table slick with blood, lanterns swaying as the ship lurches. This was not some back-alley charlatan's lair. This was the only hope a wounded sailor had if he was struck by cannon shot, musket ball, or jagged splinters. In that era, surgery on a warship was a grim performance one, where the surgeon was expected to be part carpenter, part butcher, and entirely indifferent to screams. Amputations were often the only way to save a life when infection took hold, or when limbs were shattered beyond repair by artillery. There was no knowledge of germ theory, no antiseptic to cleanse wounds, and there was certainly no anesthesia. To dull the agony, the unlucky man who needed surgery was held down by fellow sailors, sometimes with nothing more than a rope to bite on to keep from shattering his own teeth in pain. In the surgeon's hands was a hacksaw, unpolished, brutal tool meant not for precision, but for speed. Every second counted. The longer the surgery lasted, the more blood the patient lost, and the closer he came to death by shock. Historical records show that a skilled surgeon could saw through bone in less than a minute if pressed, but the work didn't end with removing the limb. Sometimes bone had to be smashed or broken deliberately to create a stump that could be closed up. That is where the mallet came in. Imagine that for a moment, the hacksaw's shrill scraping through flesh and bone. Then the surgeon calmly reaching for a wooden mallet, he would set the limb in position, or tap fragments back into alignment, or crush jagged edges to stop them protruding through skin. There are accounts of surgeons hammering splinters back into place as the patient writhed and shrieked. This was considered standard practice, not out of cruelty, but necessity. On Tudor warships, the surgeon was typically a barber surgeon, someone who learned their trade by apprenticeship rather than formal education. They might have served in city hospitals or followed armies on land before stepping aboard a ship. Of war, their kit was a leather roll or wooden chest of tools, all designed for fast work in terrible conditions. Besides the hacksaw and mallet, they carried knives for cutting muscle, irons for cauterizing vessels, and simple needles and linen thread to stitch flesh. Instruments were wiped clean with seawater or a rag. There was the hope that the patient's constitution could fight off the inevitable infection. The men who endured these operations often did so fully conscious. Some surgeons would give rum or brandy, but strong drink could thin the blood and hasten shock. Even so, sailors begged for anything to dull the unimaginable pain. Witnesses described patients screaming, weeping, or going silent in a stupor of horror. Recovery, if it came, was as dangerous as the operation itself. Infection, what they called hospital gangrene, could rot a stump within days. Maggots were sometimes used intentionally to clean dead flesh, a practice that sounds barbaric, but sometimes saved lives. What makes this history even more intense is that none of this was hidden away. It unfolded in the open, among the ship's company who heard every cry. Young boys serving as powder monkeys or cabin servants were often pressed into service as surgical assistants, forced to watch as men were sawn apart and hammered back together. The psychological toll was immense. For the wounded man, the nightmare did not end when the surgeon laid down his mallet. He might spend weeks, feverish, swaddled in filthy bandages that stuck to raw wounds. Sometimes the stumps would reopen, or bones would heal crooked. There were no prosthetics as we understand them, just carved wooden pegs, crude hooks, or nothing at all. It is easy to look back on this and recoil, to imagine that such violence belonged to savagery alone. But in Tudor times, this was innovation. Amputation with a hacksaw and mallet was, in a gruesome way, progress. Before such interventions, wounds to the limbs were almost always fatal. A shattered arm or leg would fester, blood poisoning would set in, and the man would die in agony. The surgeon's job, as brutal as it was, offered a chance, however slim, to survive. Consider the background of these conflicts. Tudor warships sailed not only to fight other navies, but to defend trade, project power, and build an empire. Battles were fought at terrifyingly close range. A broadside cannon blast could hurl iron shot and splinters that shattered limbs in a heartbeat. These injuries were so severe that there was simply no time to transport men ashore. The surgeon worked wherever there was room, sometimes on the orlop deck, the lowest space in the ship, dark, damp, and filled with the stench of bilge water and blood. Lantern light flickered over men already dying, while others waited there, turn on the table. The hacksaw and the mallet became symbols of a desperate attempt to save lives in a place designed for war, not healing. We have detailed accounts of surgeons who kept journals, describing in matter-of-fact language the procedures they performed. One wrote about using a mallet to drive home a protruding bone, knowing it would be agony for the patient, but necessary to close the wound. Another described how he would sometimes pause mid-operation to calm himself, wiping sweat from his face before picking up the saw again. Their notes rarely mention emotion, perhaps because they had to suppress it to function at all. Compassion in such an environment had to be buried under the cold demands of survival. This history, grim as it is, reveals something profound about the nature of war and medicine. The surgeon's mallet was not simply a crude tool, it was a reminder of how fragile the human body was in an age without painkillers or antibiotics. It is hard to imagine today, but in the roar of battle, amid smoke and chaos, there were moments when a man's life hinged on whether a surgeon could steady his hands, cut quickly, and smash bone into place. These were the quiet moments of horror that happened behind the scenes of naval glory. Next time you hear of Tudor triumphs at sea, remember that below deck, in the swaying lantern light, a different kind of struggle was being waged, a struggle against death itself, fought with nothing but primitive instruments, determination, and the willingness to do what had to be done. The bucket that was the toilet. Imagine you are standing on the deck of a Tudor warship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The wind is screaming across the waves. The timbers groan under the strain of salt and spray, and every man aboard is soaked to the bone. But the smell is what you'd noticed firsthand, inescapable. Sour stench that clings to your hair, your clothes, your skin. It's the smell of unwashed humanity, of rancid meat, of spoiled grain crawling with weevils, and, perhaps most unbearable of all, the smell of the latrines, which were often nothing more than wooden buckets lined up along the side of the deck. These buckets were called necessary tubs or gudgeon tubs, though nothing about them felt necessary in the sense of comfort or hygiene. They were simply the only option in a floating wooden world where privacy was a luxury no one could afford. On calmer days, the sailors would gather the buckets in designated corners or lash them against the bulwarks to prevent them tipping over with the motion of the ship. But during rough seas, or in the chaos of battle, discipline and routine vanished. A man could scarcely find a moment to eat, let alone to relieve himself properly. In storms, many sailors resorted to simply squatting over the side, gripping a rope or the gunwale for dear life as the freezing spray pelted them and the ship lurched violently underfoot. It wasn't uncommon for someone to slip and be pitched into the waves, lost forever to the darkness. Yet even that risk felt preferable to waiting for your turn with a foul-smelling bucket, already splashed with the waste of dozens of other men. This system, if it could be called, that meant that sanitation was nearly non-existent. Buckets were emptied erratically, sometimes not at all if the weather was too dangerous to tip them overboard. In the heat of summer, the contents of the buckets would ferment, forming a layer of scum that bred flies and attracted rats. These rats were more than a nuisance. They were deadly vectors of disease, gnawing into salted meat stores, contaminating flour, and spreading plague and dysentery. Sailors understood that filth could make them sick, but they had few means to prevent it. There was no knowledge of microbes, no sense of quarantine. Everything was wiped down with seawater, which did little but spread the contamination around. The ship itself became an incubator for illness. Dysentery, in particular, was so common that it was considered almost inevitable. In the cramped confines below deck where hammocks were slung only inches apart, the infection would spread from man to man in hours. Once the disease took hold, a sailor might deteriorate in days, weakened by fever, dehydration, and unstoppable diarrhea. The constant threat of dysentery and other diseases shaped the daily existence of every crewman. Imagine the fear of knowing that if you fell sick, there were no real treatments awaiting you, no clean beds, no fresh water. The surgeon's tools were intended mainly for amputations and tooth extractions, not for curing infections. A man struck with dysentery might be laid in his hammock to ride out the illness alone. He would be given a thin broth if supplies allowed, but more often, he would simply be left to weaken, while his comrades tried to keep their own distance. An impossible task in such tight quarters. Even in death, the risk did not end. Dead bodies were often kept aboard until weather allowed a burial at sea. During that time, the corpse remained among the living, a grim reminder of how easily a man could vanish from the roster. Though we often romanticize life at sea, the reality was far from heroic when it came to sanitation. A man's dignity was constantly eroded by the need to perform the most basic functions in full view of his fellows. The reek of the buckets was so overwhelming that many preferred to wait as long as they could, risking internal injury rather than endure the indignity and filth. But in battle or storm, there was no waiting. The buckets overflowed, and the waste sloshed across the deck, mixing with salt water, blood, and rain. Sailors had to wade through it, their bare feet slipping on the slime, their hands gripping the ropes for balance. They would emerge, soaked and splattered, knowing that nothing could truly wash them clean. When the voyage was long and supplies dwindled, the problem grew worse. Food grew rotten, water turned brackish, and the smell of human waste became a constant presence in every breath. Officers had slightly better conditions, but even they could not escape the stench entirely. The captain's quarters might be polished and adorned with maps and charts, but behind a thin partition, a bucket still waited, filled and emptied by the same weary stewards who risked their lives moving it through swaying passages. For men, there was no distinction at all. Whether you were a powder monkey or an experienced gunner, you shared the same buckets. You shared the same risk of dysentery. You shared the same dread that the next meal might be your last, if illness took hold. The mental toll of this relentless exposure to filth and disease cannot be overstated. Journals and logs from the period often describe men driven half-mad by the stench, unable to sleep for fear of rats or the nausea that rose in their throats. Some sailors stuffed rags soaked in vinegar into their nostrils, a desperate attempt to mask the odor. Others simply learned to accept it as a fact of life. They became hardened, indifferent to their own degradation, because there was no alternative. This was the price of service aboard His Majesty's ships, a price paid not only in blood during combat, but in health, sanity, and the small measure of dignity that most men on land could take for granted. These conditions also reveal why shipboard discipline was so harsh. Officers relied on the constant threat of punishment to maintain order in a world that was always on the edge of chaos. A man who refused to clean the buckets, or who fouled the deck in defiance, could be flogged or worse. Such punishments were not merely about enforcing hierarchy. They were attempts to contain an invisible enemy, disease. In a place where no one understood how contagion truly spread, cleanliness became a matter of fear and superstition as much as practicality. Every ship that returned to port carried not only the scars of weather and warfare, but the lingering memory of the filth that clung to every inch of timber and canvas. When we imagine the life of a Tudor sailor, it is easy to think of adventure, of vast oceans and distant lands. But the truth is that every journey was shadowed by the silent presence of disease and decay. A single bucket could become a weapon more dangerous than any cannon. And while the sailors who manned these ships may have feared enemy broadsides and storms, they also feared the smell that seeped up from below decks, the unmistakable warning that their greatest threat was not always visible on the horizon, but waiting in the darkness just beyond the lamplight. The man who was whipped until he bled in the dim confines of a Tudor warship. Discipline was not merely a codite, was an unyielding doctrine enforced with whips, iron, and fear. The ship was a floating kingdom where every man knew his place. In the hierarchy, and any breach of duty, no matter how small, could bring consequences that blurred the line between punishment and torture. Imagine a young sailor, exhausted beyond words after days of hauling, rigging, in freezing rain. His muscles trembling from malnutrition, his eyelids heavy as lead. On the night watch, when the ship rocked gently and the lantern's flame danced across the deck, he closed his eyes just for a moment. That moment was all it took. A cry rang out. The officer of the watch spotted him slumped against a barrel. In the hierarchy of naval discipline, there could be no allowances for human frailty. If one man slept, the ship was vulnerable to fire, to enemy boarding, or to the countless accidents that could turn a warship into a floating coffin. The penalty was immediate. He was dragged before the assembled crew, his arms twisted behind his back. The charges were read aloud in a voice as cold and precise as the edge of a blade. Dereliction of duty, insubordination by negligence, failure to uphold the honor of the ship, Then came the order that made every man's heart seize with dread. He was to be flogged until the officer deemed the lesson complete. Flogging was not a quick affair. It was a ritual of humiliation and agony designed to sear a memory so deep that no man would ever forget it. The Cateau Ninetails was no ordinary whip. It was a handle bound to 9 separate cords, each one knotted along its length and stiffened with tar to maximize damage. As the sailor was stripped to the waist, the reality of his punishment settled over him like a shroud. His back, pale and thin, was stretched tight across the grating where he was tied by the wrists. Silence fell over the deck, broken only by the creak of the timbers and the soft rush of the sea. Everyone watched, officers, gunners, cooks, even the ship's boy. They watched because they had to. The spectacle was part of the lesson. If you failed your duty, your suffering would be public. It would be remembered. The boatswain's mate stepped forward, Cateau Ninetails in hand. He did not relish his role, but neither did he flinch. From it, he raised the whip over his shoulder. There was no count announced aloud only, the steady rhythm of the lash and the grunts of exertion. The first stroke landed with a sound like tearing cloth. The sailor's body jerked. A thin red line appeared across his shoulders. A moment later, another, then another. Each strike cut deeper, the knots digging through skin, pulling at the flesh. The first cries came quickly. No man could maintain silence for long. But there was no sympathy in the eyes of the officers. Discipline had to be absolute. As the flogging continued, the sailor's back began to transform into something unrecognizable, livid, welts swelling in twisted patterns, darker lines crossing where the knots struck the same spot again and again. Soon, the skin split. Blood welled up in rivulets, trickling down to pool at his waistband. The Cateau Ninetails became slick with it, smearing red with every new stroke. The air filled with the metallic scent of it, mingling with sweat and the sour stink of fear. Some men looked away, unable to bear the sight. Others stared with grim resignation, reminding themselves that exhaustion was no excuse for failure, that this was the price of discipline in the Queen's Navy. For the man bound to the grating, time dissolved into a blur of pain, came in ragged gasps, his mind shrinking to the single question of whether this was the lash that would break him. And yet, in that moment of agony, he knew he had to endure. To scream was permitted, expected. Even but to beg was to be branded a coward. And when the boatswain's mate finally lowered the whip, the silence that followed was deafening. The sailor was cut down, unable to stand. He collapsed to the deck, his back a ruin of raw flesh and torn muscle. Every movement sent new shocks, of pain radiating through him. Yet he was alive. He was expected to rise the next day and take his place on watch again. In Tudor times, such punishments were justified not only as deterrence, but as a form of purification, a way to excise weakness from a man's spirit by scouring it from his flesh. The rationale was simple and merciless. A ship at sea could not afford laxity. The discipline was not designed to fit modern notions of justice. It was designed to keep the ship alive. But it exacted a toll in morale, on sanity, on the very humanity of those who witnessed and administered it. There are records of men flogged until they could no longer walk, men whose wounds festered in the damp air below deck, men who died weeks later of fever and infection. And yet no official ledger would record their deaths as executions. They were simply noted as casualties of duty. Even the survivors bore lifelong scars, physical reminders of the day they were whipped until their skin hung in strips. These scars became a silent language among sailors, a visible ledger of suffering that marked each man's passage through the gauntlet of naval service. Stories of such punishments rarely appear in the grand histories of exploration and empire. Instead, they linger in the private diaries of surgeons and the letters of sailors who risked charges of mutiny simply by describing the horror. They tell us that life aboard a Tudor warship was not merely dangerous from enemy cannon fire, disease, and storms. It was dangerous because any slip in discipline could lead to a punishment so brutal that it left the recipient forever changed. For those men, survival was not just about staying afloat. It was about holding on to some shred of dignity in a world where discipline was enforced by tearing the flesh from your bones. It was about rising the next day, your back raw and throbbing, and taking your post without complaint, because you knew that to falter again was to risk another round of the Katona entails, and perhaps, next time, you would not survive it. The smell you couldn't escape. Imagine being a sailor in the 16th century, signing on to a Tudor warship, not for glory or adventure, but simply to survive. The crown promised pay, perhaps a small share of prize money, and 3 square meals a day. But no one warned you that the rations meant to sustain you could be as lethal as any cannonball. You learned quickly that every barrel hoisted aboard carried the seeds of your own undoing. The salted pork, the dried peas, the rock-hard biscuit, called hardtack together, they made up the daily diet. And together, they turned the bellies of entire crews into battlegrounds of their own. Salted pork was the most common protein aboard ship. In theory, it was a way to preserve fresh meat indefinitely. In practice, it was a gamble. Each barrel was packed with thick slabs of pork layered in coarse salt. If you were lucky, the salt had done its job, drawing out moisture and keeping rot at bay. But luck was in short supply. On long voyages, especially in warm months, barrels frequently spoiled. Sailors spoke of the rank smell when the lid was first pried opener, reeked so pungent it turned the strongest stomach. Sometimes slimy mold would coat the pork in a white, fibrous layer. Sometimes the meat simply dissolved into a greasy paste. Yet, unless it was visibly crawling with maggots, it was issued out all the same. Rations were rations. To refuse them meant hunger. Hardtack was the other cornerstone of survival. Cornerstone hard enough to break your teeth, baked in enormous ovens on shore, hardtack was little more than flour and water, mixed into dough and cooked until it became rock solid. Stored in barrels, it lasted years, but that durability came at a price. The biscuits grew stale quickly. If any moisture crept in, mold took root. More often, weevils laid their eggs inside. Sailors cracked them open to find the flour riddled with tiny, moving insects. Some men went so far as to tap their biscuits on the table to shake the bugs free, or to hold them over a lantern flame so the creatures would crawl out. For most, the solution was simpler. Shut your eyes and eat. After all, the bugs were protein too. Then there were the dried peas, boiled into a lumpy green mash when supplies allowed. They were supposed to provide some nourishment beyond meat and biscuit, but storage and transport did them no favors. A shipment could spoil in the hold, especially if water seeped into the sacks. Sailors spoke of the rancid, sour taste when a meal of peas went bad. At best, they caused stomach cramps. At worst, they delivered days of fever and vomiting. When supply runs failed, which they often did, hunger became a companion, as constant as the creak of timbers. A sudden storm or an unexpected enemy fleet could sever supply lines. When that happened, rations were halved or quartered. Men watched one another's faces as the portions dwindled. It was an unspoken rule that no one complained too loudly. Complaints earned the lash, or worse. So they endured the ache of emptiness, the way their ribs became visible, the way their strength waned. Food poisoning was not a rare affliction, but an accepted part of life. Entire watches would be struck down by waves of nausea and diarrhea. In the close confines of the lower decks, illness spread like fire. Weak men struggled to rise from their hammocks, dragging themselves to the rail or the bilge buckets. The stench of sickness was overwhelming. The ship's surgeon could do little but prescribe rest and diluted rum. Those who survived learned to eat more carefully, to sniff each ration before bringing it to their lips, to hope that the next barrel would be fresher than the last. Yet there was no true escape. Even when supplies were good, the diet lacked what the body needed most: fresh fruits and vegetables. Scurvy followed every voyage longer than a few weeks, creeping in to claim teeth, strength, and eventually life itself. When you stood in line for your salted pork and hardtack, you were already gambling with your health. Every meal was a calculation. How hungry were you? How bad did the biscuit smell? How much longer could you hold out? Historians studying ship manifests and journals have pieced together how often these rations failed the men they were meant to sustain: the Mary Rose, the ships of Drake and Hawkins. Even the Spanish Armada none escaped the universal truth that no amount of sail or gunpowder could overcome a broken diet. Sailors sometimes fantasized about fresh bread, green vegetables, ripe fruit. They dreamed of real meals, the way some men dreamed of women or land. The yearning for fresh food was not simply longing. It was the subconscious knowledge that their bodies were slowly unraveling. This is why, when you imagine the life of a sailor, you must look past the images of cannon fire and billowing sails. You must remember the quieter struggle, the moment, when a man forced himself to swallow meat he knew was spoiled, or when he cracked open a biscuit and tried not to retch as the weevils spilled out. You must imagine the gnawing emptiness of weeks on half rations, the shared desperation when the barrels ran low. And you must remember that in the age of sail, victory and defeat often depended not on who had more guns, but on who could keep their men alive in the face of rations that seemed determined to make them sick. The ship's boy who fell from the rigging in the vast, unforgiving world of early naval warfare, there was no place for sentimentality. Every man and every boy on board had a duty that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Among the most precarious and heartbreaking roles were those assigned to ship's boys. Children scarcely into adolescence, often no older than 11 or 12, whose small, agile bodies made them indispensable aloft in the rigging. To understand how a boy could end up 60 feet in the air during a raging storm, you have to imagine the anatomy of a sailing warship. The towering masts rose like skeletal cathedrals above the deck, supporting a web of ropes and sails that controlled the ship's movement. These masts were the heart of the vessel, but they were also death traps. Climbing them was not an occasional task, it was a constant necessity. Sails had to be reefed or unfurled regardless of the weather. When the wind howled and the ship heeled over, when rain drove across the deck in stinging sheets, the sails still had to be managed. The boys climbed barefoot or in soft-soled shoes, hands gripping ropes that could be as slick as ice. In storm conditions, the mast itself could sway in great arcs. Imagine the terror of a child clinging to a rope as the world lurched beneath him, feeling the rigging jerk with each gust, the ocean a dark chasm yawning below. On the day this tragedy unfolded, the storm had come up faster than expected. Some accounts describe walls of green water striking the hull, shattering the watch's composure. The order was shouted to reef the topsails before the wind tore them loose. Among those sent aloft was a boy no more than 11. He had made the climb before. He was, by all accounts, nimble and courageous, traits the officers respected. But this time, fate was indifferent to his skill. As the ship pitched violently, he lost his grip oar, perhaps a rope parted under strain. In that instant, he was no longer a sailor, but a falling object, plummeting through the air with no chance to arrest his descent. He struck the deck so hard that men nearby claimed they felt the impact in their own bones. What made this moment uniquely cruel was who witnessed it. His father, himself a seaman, was working not 20 feet away. In an age when entire families could serve aboard a ship, fathers and sons together shared the perils and the pride of the sea. But no father was prepared to watch his child fall from the sky and land broken at his feet. According to surviving accounts, the boy lived for several hours after the fall. There were no doctors with the skills or tools to mend the shattered body of an 11-year-old who had dropped 60 feet onto oak planking. His breaths came ragged, punctuated by spasms of pain. The ship's surgeon, whose experience lay more in amputations and setting simple fractures, could offer nothing beyond laudanum and the last comforts of touch. In those hours, the father remained close, speaking quietly to a son whose eyes drifted in and out of awareness. The moment transcended rank, discipline, and the unbending expectations of naval duty. Even hardened officers looked away, recognizing that there was no training that could fortify a man against such sorrow. What is striking is how unremarkable this kind of event was in the context of its time. It was understood, almost with grim acceptance, that children were expendable. Ship's boys signed articles of service like any adult, their wages a pittance, their rations scarcely adequate to sustain their growing bodies. And yet, they were sent aloft again and again because the rigging demanded hands that were small and quick. To refuse an order, even for a child, was a punishable offense. Some boys carried scars from beatings as well as from rope burns. Discipline aboard a warship was absolute. To hesitate could doom the ship. So, even at the height of a gale, even when common sense might cry out against sending children into the rigging, the orders came all the same, delivered in the clipped, tones of officers who had seen too much loss to flinch, we tend to imagine the sea as a place of adventure, a stage for heroism and discovery. But the truth was far more brutal. For every story of naval glory, there were 100 quiet tragedies, like that of this boy, whose name rarely appeared in muster rolls, whose death was recorded in a single line of the ship's log. His father survived the voyage. We have no record of whether he ever climbed the rigging again or whether he left the service when the ship reached port. But it is not difficult to imagine the weight he carried ever after. These ships were not only machines of war, they were floating worlds with their own laws, their own cruelties. Childhood was not spared. The mortality rate for ship's boys was staggering. Falls, disease, malnutrition, and violence culled their numbers relentlessly. If a boy survived to reach adulthood, he did so with a body hardened by constant labor and a mind shaped by memories that few on land could comprehend. Climbing the rigging was more than a physical act. It was a daily confrontation with mortality. Every time a boy set foot on the ratlins, he knew that a misstep or a sudden gust could end everything in the space of a heartbeat. The culture of the Navy required that fear be swallowed, hidden behind a veneer of discipline. But in the quiet hours after a fall like this one, the facade cracked. Men would sit in the dim lantern light, silent, their thoughts circling the question no one dared to ask aloud. Was it worth it? Was the discipline, the endless striving to master ship and sea, ever worth the price extracted in young lives? The story of the ship's boy who fell from the rigging stands as a stark reminder of how history is written, not only in battles won and territories claimed, but in the human cost paid by those too small to choose their fate. In the end, his death was noted in the log, the deck was swabbed clean, and the sails were trimmed. The ship continued on its mission, as if nothing had happened. That, perhaps, is the most haunting part of all. The storm that took half the fleet, imagine the year 1588, when Europe held its breath as the greatest naval force ever assembled, set sail to crush England's defenses. The Spanish Armada, over 100 ships, strong-glided northward, their sails a white forest on the horizon. To Tudor sailors, the sight must have felt like staring into the jaws of fate itself. The English had their own formidable fleet, but even their best warships were no match in sheer scale. Everyone expected that the decisive blow would be struck in cannon fire and boarding actions. Yet, in the end, it was the sea itself that proved the most ruthless adversary. The Spanish Armada's defeat is often recited as a triumph of strategy and naval gunfire. But this is only part of the story. What many overlook is the series of violent storms that swallowed ship after ship. Storms so fierce they undid months of preparation and drained the strength of both sides. Tudor warships, though faster and more maneuverable than the towering Spanish galleons, were not immune to the ocean's wrath. Their hulls creaked under the strain of high waves. Their masts groaned like living things about to splinter. On those Tudor decks, the fear was palpable. Sailors knew that the seas around Ireland and Scotland were treacherous, prone to sudden gales that could rise in hours. These ships were packed to their limits with cannons. Vessels bristled with more than 30 guns stowed on multiple decks. Cannon barrels and their iron shot added immense weight high above the waterline. A ship that rode to high and calm weather could suddenly heel over in a storm, pulled down by the momentum of her own armament. Tudor naval design was innovative, but the balance between firepower and seaworthiness was never fully solved. Ballast stones, sand, even bricks was supposed to offset the weight of guns and stores. But in the chaos of loading, resupplying, and preparing for battle, proper ballast control was often neglected. Some ships took on extra supplies hastily, never redistributing the load evenly across the hold. Others had spent weeks rolling in channel swells and had ballast gradually shift to one side. The result was catastrophic. In the worst storms, vessels capsized without warning. Men scrambled up slippery decks, clinging to ropes and rails as the ship turned over beneath them. In the darkness and spray, there was no chance to launch a boat. The chronicles of this disaster are chilling in their matter-of-fact detail. Spanish accounts describe hulls cracking like eggshells as they were hurled onto shoals. English observers noted how the storm turned victory into a grim spectacle wreckage littering the coasts. bodies washing ashore in the days that followed. But even Tudor warships that survived the gale bore scars that would dog them for months. Broken spars, split hull seams, waterlogged powder, and exhausted crews. Some limped back to port half sunk, kept afloat only by frantic bailing and the luck of a temporary lull in the wind. To imagine this scene is to understand why sailors of the time saw the sea as a capricious god. One moment, you could be a celebrated warrior, triumphant in battle. The next, you were on your knees, praying as towering waves smashed the ship's side. For many sailors, the terror of the Armada storms left deeper wounds than combat itself. The ocean took no sides, nothing for crowns or crests. Even before the Armada reached English waters, the strain of the voyage was already telling. Disease and poor provisioning weakened crews. As the fleet pushed north after battle, they were already near the breaking point. When the storms struck, they had no strength left to resist. Ropes frayed under relentless strain, sails shredded to ribbons. For Tudor captains trying to shepherd their ships through chaos, the choices were brutal. Jettison precious supplies and guns to lighten the ship, or risk rolling and capsizing. Some refused to give up their armament, believing the Armada might regroup. Others made the agonizing decision to dump cannon into the sea, sacrificing firepower to keep the ship upright. We have eyewitness accounts from sailors who watched in horror as cannons were heaved over board-grade iron monsters that had cost a fortune to forge and transport. They struck the waves and vanished in an instant, a final offering to the merciless sea. Still, it was often not enough. The combination of overloaded decks and shifting ballast doomed many ships regardless of what they threw away. For those who survived, the memory of that storm would become a lifelong specter. Men who had faced enemy fire without flinching wept openly when describing the wind's howl. The sensation of decks slanting beneath their feet, the feeling of cold sea washing up past their knees as the ship began to founder. Some never sailed again. Others bore the scars and nightmares until their dying day. In the official English chronicles, the storm is often framed as Providenza, sign that divine favor rested with Elizabeth's England. Yet, for the common sailor, it was simply another chapter in a life of relentless hazard. Victory tasted bitter when so many comrades vanished into the waves. Even among those who triumphed in battle, many returned to port hollow-eyed and shivering. Haunted by memories of a night when no amount of seamanship or courage could save half the fleet, it is easy to romanticize the naval glories of the Tudor. Age the thundering broadsides, the clash of boarding parties, the flags streaming in the wind. But beneath those stories lies the simple, unchanging truth that the sea itself was always the greatest power. The storm that took half the fleet remains a testament to how, in 1588, nature intervened in human conflict, deciding in hours what strategy and ambition had failed to settle for years. No matter how mighty the ships, how skilled the crews, how proud the nations, all were ultimately at the mercy of the ocean's will. And in that storm, the ocean demanded a price that neither the Spanish nor the English would ever forget. The rats that crawled into wounds. Imagine a ship creaking in the dark swell of the ocean. The timbers soaked with salt spray, and the mingled stench of sweat, blood, and spoiled food. The candles burned low in the cramped gun decks, flickering against rows of hammocks that swung with each heave of the waves. Inside those hammocks lay men who had endured musket fire, splintered wood, and iron grapeshot. Their wounds were not clean incisions, they were ragged gashes, torn muscles, and shattered bones. The ship's surgeon, working with tools more suited for carpentry than medicine, had done what he could to stitch and bandage the injured. But once the fighting was over, the real ordeal began. Because when the darkness fell, the rats came out. Not a few, but entire colonies, their bodies slick and thin from generations of scavenging. These were not shy creatures. They had grown, accustomed to the presence of men, to the groans and whimpers that signaled fresh blood. In the half-light of the lanterns, they would creep down from the beams and scurry across the decks, their claws tapping on the planks. They moved with an eerie confidence, knowing that the men in those hammocks were often too weak to resist. Some sailors tried to wrap themselves entirely in their blankets, hoping to keep the vermin at bay, but it was never enough. The smell of a wound, of clotting blood and festering pus, drew the rats like a promise. Imagine a man drifting in and out of fevered sleep. He has survived the roar of cannon fire, the hammering impact of splinters, and the agony of the surgeon's blade. He clings to the hope that if he can endure the pain, he might see land again. But as he dozes, he feels a tug at the edge of the dressing wrapped around his leg. At first, he thinks it is a fellow sailor shifting in his hammock. Then he feels the unmistakable pressure of tiny teeth testing the wound. He jerks awake, only to see dark shapes slipping away into the shadows. If he is strong enough, he will lash out, shouting hoarsely. But many were too spent, too broken by loss of blood and infection, to do more than weep in helpless disgust. This was not an isolated horror, but a nightly ritual on ships that carried too many men and too little food. The rats, starving and emboldened, were notorious for chewing through grain sacks, eating candle tallow, and gnawing the leather straps of equipment. But it was the wounded who suffered the most. Every deck was alive with the knowledge that once the lanterns were doused, the rats would begin their foraging, their tiny bodies slipping between hammocks and barrels. Sailors who were not injured might try to chase them off, but they could never keep watch every hour. There were too many mouths to feed, and the ship itself was a labyrinth of hidden corners where rats could nest unseen. The deeper problem was that the ship was a perfect breeding ground for vermin. Supplies stored in the hold attracted them in droves. If a cask broke open, it might be swarming with rat droppings by morning. The sailors could do little to protect their food or their bodies. Some accounts describe men laying knives or clubs within reach as they slept, ready to strike when they felt the telltale scratching. But fatigue and sickness dulled their senses, and more than one man awoke to find that rats had chewed the edges of a wound ragged, enlarging the injury and making infection all but certain. The consequences were catastrophic. Wounds that might have healed turned septic. Blood poisoning claimed men who had survived the initial trauma. The rats themselves carried fleas, which were a vector for typhus and plague. The crew, weakened by poor diet and long months at sea, had little defense against the tide of disease. The surgeon's supplies were limited. His instruments, rarely cleaned, were as likely to spread infection as treat it. If a man developed a fever and the wound turned black, there was little to be done beyond administering laudanum for the pain. In the quiet hours before dawn, the dying often whispered that they could still feel the rats crawling over them, even when no animals were present. There was no real solution. Traps could be set, but they were never enough. The rats bred faster than they could be killed. Cats were sometimes kept aboard, but a few cats could not defeat an infestation that thrived in every gap between the timbers. The sailors themselves became resigned to the presence of these creatures. They learned to sleep lightly, to keep their limbs tucked in tight, to ignore the scurrying sounds and the occasional squeal. It was part of life at sea, as inevitable as the heaving deck and the hunger that gnawed at a man's belly. The indignity of it surviving the enemy only to be eaten alive in your sleep was a reality that few on land could imagine. For the wounded, every night became a test of endurance. They prayed for sunrise, when the rats would retreat and the chance of survival would improve by a slim margin. Yet each dawn also brought the smell of death and rot, of wounds that had worsened in the dark, of bodies that would have to be sewn into canvas and committed to the sea. In the end, this was the hidden enemy of every wooden warship, not merely the cannonballs that smashed through the hull or the storms that could capsize a vessel in moments, but the tiny, relentless scavengers that fed on weakness. The rats were a living symbol of the ship's decay, a reminder that beneath the flags and glory and iron discipline, every man aboard was still just flesh, vulnerable to the smallest, most merciless of predators. The cook, who was boiled alive, imagined the galley of a Tudor worshipper, cramped, suffocating box of scorched timber and iron, tucked deep in the belly of the vessel. It was here that the cook labored day and night, feeding hundreds of men with the most basic rations imaginable: salted meat, hard biscuit, thin gruel, and whatever else could be coaxed into something barely edible. The galley was a place of constant danger. Flames roared in iron braziers, casks of pitch and tar were stacked in corners, and scalding water bubbled in great iron pots tethered to the walls with chains. A single spark could turn the ship's kitchen into a death trap. On this particular day, that spark came when no one expected it. The ship pitched on a rising swell, and somewhere in the shadows, a lantern slipped from its hook. It shattered on the deck, spilling hot oil into a tangle of ropes and tar-slick planks. In the blink, Of an eye, fire leaped up, seizing the air itself with a hungry roar. The cook barely had time to understand what was happening. He turned, saw the wave of flame coming toward him, and tried to run, but the galley offered no escape. A barrel of pitch split open, gushing molten black liquid across the floor. At the same instant, one of the pots of boiling water, lashed to its bracket by a rusted iron chain, came loose and toppled forward. The contents water, heated nearly to the point of steam, poured across the cook's legs and waist in a hissing flood. Witnesses said he screamed in a voice that cut through the roar of the fire, a voice so high and ragged that it sounded inhuman. His skin sloughed off in sheets as the boiling water ate through flesh, and the hot tar pooled around his feet, clinging like glue. There was no time to rescue him. The fire grew with every second, consuming the galley walls. Smoke poured up the hatchways and seeped into every corridor. Men rushed with buckets, blankets, anything they could find, but no one could reach the cook. His cries echoed through the ship, a reminder that catastrophe could descend without warning. For 5 minutes, he screamed. 5 minutes of agony that felt like a lifetime to every soul forced to listen. The men on deck heard it and went pale, gripping ropes with white-knuckled hands. In the gun decks, the powder monkeys froze in terror. Sure, the fire would find the gunpowder next, but it was the cook who bore the worst of it, trapped in a corner, blinded by steam, unable even to drag himself clear. The fire eventually subsided when the crew formed a desperate line of buckets and smothered the blaze with wet sailcloth. When they finally reached the cook, he was silent. His body was twisted in a final spasm of pain, skin blistered and blackened, tar fused to muscle and bone. Even hardened officers looked away when they lifted what was left of him onto a canvas sheet. In the records, his death was marked with a single line: Cook, deceased, galley fire. But such a cold note cannot convey the horror of that day. For the men who survived, it became a story retold in whispers. They spoke of the smell burning meat and hot pitch, mingling in a stench so foul it seemed to cling to their skin. They remembered the sound of the cook's voice, that raw shrieking that proved no discipline, no courage, no prayer could always save you from the ship's hazards. This was the reality of Tudor naval life, that the sea was not the only enemy. Fire, scalding water, boiling tarthies were terrors that waited in every hold and galley. To work below deck meant living with the knowledge that a moment's misstep could bring an end to horrific to contemplate. Some men would later say that the cook's death changed the ship itself. For weeks afterward, sailors grew jumpy whenever the lanterns swayed or the braziers flared. Every creak of the timbers sounded like the start of another inferno. The galley was rebuilt, scrubbed clean of char and soot, but no one ever felt safe there again. The new cook kept his lanterns triple fastened. He never worked alone, and at night, the men would lie awake and remember that their ship was not only a place of exploration and conquest, but a floating coffin waiting to be sealed. In a time when life was cheap and death often came without warning, the story of the cook who was boiled alive became part of the unspoken lore of Tudor sailors. It was a lesson written not in ink, but in scar tissue and memory, that the sea might claim your life, but the ship itself could devour you first. The rations that made you sick. Imagine standing below deck on a Tudor warship in the middle of an endless sea. The air is thick with the stench of bilge water, mildew, unwashed bodies, and something more sour something that drifts from the barrels stacked like coffins along the walls. Those barrels hold your rations, the food meant to sustain you through months of punishing labor, storms, and battles. But you already know that inside them lies a gamble. Every meal is a wager against rot, infestation, and decay. You can smell it even before the lids are pried open, the rancid temps of spoiled meat mixing with damp wood and stale air. Salted pork is one of the staples. In theory, it's preserved against time and the elements by layers of salt so dense that the flesh feels almost petrified. But in practice, the barrels often leak or crack. Seawater seeps in. Bacteria flourish in the brine, slowly transforming the pork into a foul gray sludge. When the cook fishes out a chunk, you can see the fat gone yellow and the meat crawling with tiny worms. If you're lucky, it's only putrid. If you're not, it harbors poisons you can't taste until your belly cramps and you feel the first shivers of fever. Alongside the pork are sacks of dried peace tuff, little pellets meant to be boiled into a thin soup. but they too harbor dangers. Weeks at sea means the sacks are riddled with weevils and other insects that lay their eggs in the seams. By the time they reach your bowl, you can watch the larvae wriggling among the peas. Some sailors pick them out, most simply stir them under the surface and pretend they aren't there. Hunger makes even revulsion an indulgence you can't afford. Then there is the infamous hardtack, a biscuit so hard you must break it with a mallet or the butt of a knife before you can even think of eating it. In dry storage, it might last for years, but lasting is not the same as nourishing. When the cook hands you your portion, you bang it against the table to knock out the weevils and hope the mold is only superficial. More than one man has cracked a tooth on a piece of hardtack. More than one has tried to soak it in water, only to find that the water itself goes cloudy and sour with contamination. Still, you eat it, you have no choice. And so, day after day, you choke down what's offered. Sometimes it makes you sick, immediately vomiting over the rail, body racked with cramps so fierce you can hardly stand. Other times, the sickness creeps in slowly, a dull ache in the gut, a rising fever that leaves you shivering on your hammock. The ship's surgeon might try to help, but in this era, medicine is a matter of bloodletting and superstition. Food poisoning was called the flux, and it could sweep through a crew in days, reducing strong men to hollow-eyed skeletons. When the supply runs failed, which they often did, hunger became something else entirely. You'd watch the last barrels of pork disappear, the last sacks of peas scraped clean. Every man measured his rations with grim precision, knowing there was no promise of rescue. The officers tried to maintain order, but desperation loosened every restraint. Men stole from each other. They raided the cook's stores at night, risking flogging or hanging. A few simply wasted away, refusing to eat the crawling, stinking remnants in the hold. Scurvy was the inevitable companion to these meals. Fresh fruits and vegetables were impossible to keep for long, so your body slowly betrayed you. First came the fatigues, so heavy it felt like your bones were turning to sand. Then the bleeding gums, the teeth loosening in your mouth, old wounds, reopened, bleeding as if they'd never healed. Your skin grew pale, then yellow. Some men's legs swelled to twice their size, the flesh splitting like overripe fruit. You knew what it meant, but there was nothing to be done. Scurvy didn't care if you were brave or pious. It came for everyone who ate the rations, and nothing else. This was the hidden war fought on every Tudor ship a battle, not against Spanish, galleons, or towering waves, but against the very food that was supposed to keep you alive. Officers wrote logs about tonnage and supply dates, but they could not record the quiet horror of sitting down to a meal and wondering if this time it would be the one that killed you. They didn't write about the nights when men lay groaning in the darkness, too weak to rise even when the rats came to scavenge the crumbs. In letters home, if they survived, the voyage sailors sometimes confessed that the fear of starvation was worse than the fear of battle. A cannonball could end you in a moment. The rations ended you slowly, by degrees. They hollowed you out from within, so that even if you survived, you returned to land with a stomach that never quite settled. A memory of sour pork and weevil-less biscuits that never left you. And yet, somehow, they endured. Because to refuse the food was to choose death outright. So they swallowed it, they choked it down, and they prayed it would sustain them just long enough to see port again. In the end, this was the reality of life aboard a Tudor warship, that every meal was an act of courage, and every mouthful a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. The pressed man who jumped overboard imagined living a quiet life in a small coastal village, tending nets or repairing a thatched roof, when a band of armed men comes for you without warning. They are the king's agents, authorized by law to seize any able-bodied man they deem necessary. This was the cruel machinery of impressment, the system that allowed Tudor warships to fill their ranks with unwilling sailors. Their consent irrelevant, their futures swallowed by the state's demands. You might have been a fisherman, a cooper, a farmer's son. None of it mattered when the press gang arrived. They carried warrants and cudgels and the absolute authority to rip men from their families. Once you were in their hands, your fate was sealed. They dragged you through the narrow lanes of your village as neighbors turned away, too frightened to intervene. You were marched down to the harbor where the ship loomed like a dark fortress. The air was sharp with the tang of tar and salt. the distant echo of gulls circling overhead. You could smell the ship before you boarded the stink of bilge water, rotting food, unwashed bodies. You didn't have time to gather your things or say proper farewells. They shoved you up the gangplank, and the ship swallowed you whole. This was how that man came to be there, pressed into service against his will. The officers logged his name and age in the muster book, but to them, he was just another body to haul ropes and swab decks. He was shown a hammock below decka, dank, creaking space already filled with the exhausted sighs of other pressed men. They told him the rules: stand watch when ordered, do your duty without complaint, and remember that any defiance would be punished by the lash. Some men tried to make peace with their fate. Others carried a private, flickering hope that they might someday escape. On the first night, as the ship rocked gently at anchor, that man lay in his hammock, staring into the darkness. He could hear the groans of the timbers and the murmured prayers of the other pressed men. He thought of the family he had left behind, of the ordinary life that had vanished in an instant. He knew the voyage ahead could last months or years. He knew that disease, battle, or discipline might end him long before he ever set foot on land again, and he knew he could not endure it. When the deck watch changed and the lanterns grew dim, he rose quietly. No one noticed him climb the ladder. To the main deck, the cold night wind caught him by surprise, raising gooseflesh along his arms. The sea stretched in every direction, black and endless. He walked to the rail and looked down. The water was ink, swirling beneath the hull, promising both terror and release. For a moment, he hesitated. Perhaps he thought of the consequences if he were caught. Perhaps he wondered if the ocean would be quick, or if it would claim him slowly. But in the end, he chose the only freedom left to him. He climbed the rail and slipped into the dark. There was no cry, no splash loud enough to draw attention over the groan of the rigging. He simply vanished. It was hours before anyone noticed the empty hammock. At first, the officers suspected desertion. Perhaps he had hidden somewhere on board. But when they searched every hold and locker, they found nothing. The sea had claimed him. It was several days later, when the dawn was just breaking over the waves, that a sailor spotted something pale and bobbing near the hull. A longboat was dispatched, and the body was retrieved. The cold had taken him swiftly, but the look on his face, some said, was not of fear, but of grim relief, as if the ocean, in all its merciless vastness, had granted him a kinder fate than the ship ever could. The ship's log recorded the incident in a single clipped entry. One pressed man found drowned. But the men who had watched him led aboard in chains never forgot it. They whispered about him in their hammocks, the man who had rather faced the deep than surrender his life to the king's navy. Some envied his escape, though none dared follow his example. The officers, for their part, said little. They understood that impressment was necessary to maintain the fleet. But they also knew it was a form of theft or robbery of a man's right to choose his own destiny. The practice of impressment left scars far deeper than a lash ever could. It stripped away the last illusions of freedom and ownership over one's life. For the men pressed into service, each day was a balancing act between obedience and despair. They lived with the knowledge that their bodies were no longer truly their own, that any attempt to flee could end in execution or in the cold embrace of the sea. In that way, the story of the man who jumped overboard became a silent testament to every sailor's fear that in the end the ship itself was a prison without walls, and the waves were the only way out. The surgeon who used boiling oil imagined the aftermath of a naval battle in the Tudor age. The guns have finally fallen silent, leaving the ship adrift in a haze of powder smoke. The deck is slick with blood and strewn with splintered wood, the air choking with the metallic stench of carnage. All around, men stumble and crawl, clutching shattered limbs and torn bellies. The roar of cannons has been replaced by the lower, more intimate sounds of ragged moans of the dying and the cries of the wounded. Below deck, in the makeshift surgery, a scene unfolds that no ballad or official dispatch ever cared to describe in detail. This is the surgeon's domain, a narrow, dim compartment near the keel where the wounded are carried one by one, their faces chalk white or shining with sweat. There is no privacy, no separation between the living and the dying. Every man waiting for treatment sees what happens to the one before him. And the worst part is not the amputation itself. It is what follows. The surgeon works quickly because speed is the only mercy he can offer. His apron is already stiff with dried blood. He grips a bone saw that has been used so many times its teeth are notched dull. When a man is hauled in with a mangled arm bone, protruding, flesh torn like wet canvas, there is no time to argue or plead. A couple of sailors hold him down by the shoulders. Another takes hold of his good arm, bracing him so he does not buck himself off the table. The surgeon meets his gaze only briefly before lowering the saw to the limb. The sawing itself is not quiet. The rasp of blade against bone is louder than any scream, and it can take a full minute to sever the limb, sometimes longer if the saw binds in the marrow. But the true horror is still to come, because if the stump is left as it is, bleeding freely, the man will die in minutes. The surgeon has to close the wound, and in this age, there is only one sure method to do it. He nods to his mate, who is tending the brazier, where a cauldron of oil has been heating since the first gun was fired. The oil is not warm. It is boiling, bubbling in the iron pot, shimmering with a deadly, perfect heat. It is a weapon as much as a treatment, designed to seal arteries and kill whatever corruption lurks in torn flesh. The mate draws a ladle of it, the metal hissing as it leaves the pot. The smell is sharp, acrid, almost sweet in its wrongness. The surgeon gives the signal, the mate steps forward, raises the ladle and pours. The moment the oil touches the raw stump, the man his mouth tears open in a scream that is pure animal terror. It echoes off the beams overhead, so loud it drowns out every other noise in the surgery. Men waiting their turn press back against the bulkheads, eyes wide with horror. Some retch, others weep silently, but no one looks away. They can't. The scream is a sound that cuts into your soul, that tells you more vividly than any sermon how thin the membrane is between life and oblivion. The boiling oil does its work. The flesh sits. The smell changes, becomes something that will linger in your nose long after you leave the ship. Mixture of charred meat and burned cloth and the acrid temps of scorched hair. The screaming goes on until the man's body begins to fail. His voice cracks, becomes a horse rattle, then stops altogether. Sometimes he faints. Sometimes he remains conscious, shuddering and whimpering as the surgeon finally binds the stump with linen soaked in vinegar. This scene plays out again and again for every wounded man unlucky enough to survive the first assault. The surgeon does not pause to grieve or even reflect. He cannot. There are too many patients. The ladle is dipped back into the cauldron, the oil stirred to keep it hot. The screams rise again, a ghastly litany that seeps through the hull and drifts up the ladders to the deck. Sailors standing watch can hear it, even over the slap of waves against the planks. They shift uneasily, crossing themselves or whispering quick prayers, knowing that at any moment the next broadside could send them below to take their place on the surgeon's table. To modern eyes, this method seems barbaric, a cruelty piled atop suffering. But in that time, it was considered progress. Before the use of boiling oil, amputations often ended in death from blood loss or infection. At least the cauterization gave men a chance to live if they could endure the agony. In a world without anesthesia, there was no gentle way to be saved. You either had the strength to survive the treatment, or you didn't. And so, in the hidden heart of the ship, the surgeon did his grim work with as much skill as any craftsman. He was both healer and executioner, balancing each man's life on the edge of a blade and the sear of hot oil. Those who survived carried the memory in their dreams for the rest of their lives. The smell, the screams, the moment when the oil met the flesh and every other thought was burned away. When you hear stories of naval glory of daring captures and heroic battles, remember that this was also part of it. That the price of every victory was measured in the agony of the wounded and the skill of the man whose hands wielded the ladle. In the darkness of the lower decks, with only the lanterns flickering over the blood-slick floor, the surgeon and his boiling oil held back death by a thread. And sometimes, even that was not enough. The gunners who went deaf imagined standing on the gun deck of a Tudor warship, pressed shoulder to shoulder with men whose faces are smeared black with soot, whose hands are blistered from rope burns and lie. The deck is so low you can barely stand upright. The planks are slick with sweat and gunpowder residue. Overhead, the beams vibrate with every distant impact. But here, below, You are about to create a thunder so violent it will echo through your skull for the rest of your life. The order comes like the tolling of a bell. Run out the guns, and the crews heave against the tackles, dragging the iron cannons into firing position. Each gun weighs thousands of pounds, a lumbering beast of cast metal that demands every ounce of your strength. Powder monkeys, young boys no older than 12, dart between the guns with canvas cartridges, full of powder. The gunners ram the charges home, stuff the wadding, and jam the iron shot into place. They work by rote because there is no time for hesitation. The enemy is close. The air is already so thick with smoke you can't see past the next cannon. Your eyes water and burn. Your throat rasps from the soot. But you focus only on your hands, on the rammer and the slow match. Because the penalty for distraction is death, not from the enemy, then from the recoil of your own gun. At the command to fire, you brace. You know what is coming, but no amount of experience ever softens it. The match drops to the vent, and for one suspended instant, the gun seems almost calm, like a sleeping hound about to wake. Then the world erupts. The blast is a violence that seizes your entire body. You don't merely hear it to feel it hammer your chest, punch your eardrums, shake your teeth in their sockets. The report inside the enclosed deck is so loud it becomes almost beyond sound, a concussion that leaves you stunned and reeling. There is no ear protection, no concept of muffling the roar. When you blink away the flash, you realize your hearing has vanished. All you perceive is a high, keening ring that drowns out the shouted commands and the screams. You look around and see other men's mouths moving in silent panic. You taste blood at the back of your throat and realize it is also leaking from your ears. But there is no time to dwell on it. The gun must be swabbed out before the lingering sparks ignite the next charge prematurely. You stagger forward, one hand pressed against your head, and seize the sponge. Every movement is an agony, because the blast has left your skull throbbing. Like a split drum, the next round is loaded. You try to gauge the timing by watching the lieutenant's gestures, but everything feels unreal, wrapped in a suffocating cocoon of muffled pain. When the next cannon fires, the concussion seems to drive you deeper into that ringing silence. A few men faint outright. A few simply stand slack-jawed, eyes vacant, until an officer cuffs them back to awareness. Hours pass this way. In a prolonged engagement, the guns can fire dozens of times, each blast tearing away another shred of your hearing. Some men are lucky if, you can call it that, hand only lose part of their range. Others go completely deaf before they reach 30. It happens gradually at first, a dullness in the ears, voices blurred, the constant ringing. But then the dullness becomes a void. No command reaches you without a shove. You read lips as best you can. You learn to watch your mates for cues when to haul, when to ram, when to fire. You never speak of it. To admit you cannot hear is to risk your place in the crew or to be seen as weak. So you pretend, you nod when spoken to, even if you have no idea what was said. In the aftermath of battle, when the guns have fallen silent and the decks are littered with shattered timbers and spent shot, you sit on the breech of your cannon and try to will the sound back into your skull. Some men cry because they can no longer hear their own voices. Others press cloths to their ears to staunch the slow trickle of blood. The surgeons can do nothing. They tell you that in time the bleeding will stop, but your hearing will not return. It is simply the price of your trade. They call it gunner's deafness, but that phrase is too small for the reality. It is a creeping obliteration of one of the few senses that tether you to the world. When you lose it, you lose more than sound. You lose the ability to know when danger approaches, when your shipmates cry out, when the cannons prepare to fire again. The silence becomes as deadly as any wound. Yet men volunteered for gun crews all the same. The work was grueling and dangerous, but it earned respect and better pay. Even as they went deaf, many remained in service, too proud or too desperate to abandon their posts. In time, some learned to feel the vibrations of the deck to sense when the cannons were about to fire. Others developed a sixth sense for the rhythms of battle, a way of moving in the chaos when all other guidance had failed them. If you ever read about these battles in clean, orderly account states, fleets, victors know that none of those words can capture what it meant to stand behind the guns. they do not tell you about the men who came home in silence, whose ears never stopped ringing, whose world had shrunk to a dim, wordless haze. Their sacrifice was not written in medals or victory speeches, but in the long, unending quiet that waited for them after every battle was done. The sailor who died for a loaf of bread. Imagine a ship adrift on a gray, merciless sea, her sails slack in a stagnant breeze, her men hollow-eyed and brittle with hunger. The voyage had already stretched weeks beyond expectation, the supplies, whittled down to crumbs and brine. Rations were measured with trembling hands, every portion weighed and accounted for, and still it was never enough. At first, the hunger was only a dull, persistent ache, a gnawing that could be soothed with hardtack or a cup of thin broth. But when the salt pork turned rancid and the biscuits became infested with worms, the ache transformed into something darker and emptiness that eclipsed thought itself. By the third week of near starvation, the men spoke little. They moved, like shadows between the guns and rigging, their cheeks hollow, their tempers stripped bare. In that kind of hunger, no man could be certain what he would do to survive. That is why, when the rumor began to whisper in the darkness that the captain's stores still held bread untouched by rot or insects, every ear strained to hear. No one knew exactly where the bread was kept, but everyone imagined it. Soft loaves tucked in the back of a locked locker, safe from the mold that had claimed everything else. To most, it remained a fantasy, a cruel beacon of hope that only sharpened their misery. But for one man, the thought of that bread grew so loud he could no longer ignore it. No record survives of his name, only that he was a sailor like any other, pressed or conscripted, far from home, already shriveled by hunger. Perhaps he thought that if he could just taste that bread one piece, one mouthful, he might find the strength to endure. Perhaps he knew even then what the penalty would be if he were caught, but decided death was no worse than this slow dissolution. One night, while most of the crew lay fitful in their hammocks, he crept aft. He worked the lock with hands that shook so badly he almost gave up, but at last it yielded, and when he lifted the lid and saw the loaves, the smell of them sour and precious broke something inside him. He took one, only one, and he ran. It was not far enough. A sentry on the quarterdeck heard the locker creak shut. The alarm was raised. Before the man had reached the ladder down to the gun deck, the master Tarms seized him by the collar. The bread fell from his grasp and landed on the planks with a hollow thud that seemed to echo through every gut on the ship. When the lanterns swung close, the faces of the onlookers were not angry-only tired and afraid. Because if a man could be hanged for a loaf of bread, what would become of them all? The captain was summoned. He appeared on deck wrapped in his cloak, eyes heavy-lidded, but implacable. The sentence came without hesitation. Theft from the captain's stores was a capital offense, no matter the hunger. An offense against the chain of command. A violation of order when order was the only thing left to hold the ship together. And so the punishment was pronounced death by hanging at dawn from the mainmast. There was no trial, no further plea. No man dared to speak in the sailor's defense. Even pity was dangerous when the captain's authority had to remain absolute. So the condemned was led below to wait out his final hours. Some said he spent them in prayer. Others said he simply sat in silence, holding the crust of bread that had been returned to him not to eat. But because it was all he had left, when dawn came, the crew was assembled. They stood in rows across the deck, gaunt silhouettes in the rising light. The wind had picked up at last, carrying the mingled scents of salt and tar, and the sourness of human fear. The condemned man was brought forward, his steps unsteady. No one met his gaze. 2 Marines climbed the rigging to fasten the noose to the mast. As they secured it, the boatswain called the men to attention. The sentence was read aloud, each word as cold and precise as a blade. Theft, insult to the captain's honor, dereliction of duty. When the rope was placed around his neck, the sailor did not resist. Some later claimed he looked almost relieved. Perhaps in that moment he found a kind of peace that hunger could no longer reach. As the order was given and the noose tightened, a single cry rose a sound that was neither protest nor confession, but something in between. The deck fell silent. The body hung there, swaying with the ship's slow roll. A warning, a lesson, a monument to the fact that hunger could turn any man into a thief and any ship into a place where mercy was a luxury. No one could afford. The body was left there all day, as custom required. Sailors carried out their duties with their eyes fixed anywhere but the mast. The gunners checked their charges. The riggers adjusted the lines. Powder monkeys scurried past with lowered heads. But no one forgot. The image of the man who died for a loaf of bread burned itself into every mind. A reminder that there was no safety from hunger or law. Not here, not on a Tudor warship that drifted between life and death on the whim of wind and fortune. By evening, when the body was finally lowered and sewn into canvas for burial at sea, the men stood by the rail and watched the bundle slip beneath the waves. No one spoke, no one wept, but all felt the same chill, quiet knowledge that when food grew scarce and discipline grew harsher, it could have been any one of them. In the darkness that followed, the sailors lay sleepless in their hammocks, listening to the groan of the hull, each man wondering how long he would last before desperation made him reach for something forbidden, and whether he would have the courage or the weakness to do the same. The cramped coffin below deck. Imagine descending a narrow hatch into the darkness below deck, the lantern light flickering against low, sweat-stained beams. The air is so close, it feels alive, a thick mixture of unwashed bodies, damp wood, and stale breath. This was not a space designed for comfort, or even dignity, was a necessary concession to the brutal arithmetic of warships. How many men could be crammed into a hull built for cannons and cargo? Here, in the cramped coffin below deck, hundreds of sailors were forced to exist, day after day, in a state of suffocating confinement, so absolute that death sometimes slipped in unnoticed. Space was measured in inches, not feet. Hammocks were slung in tight rows, each no more than 18 inches apart. Imagine trying to sleep while your neighbor's elbow jutted into your ribs, or his breath warmed your cheek. There was no privacy, no relief. Even turning over required negotiation with the bodies pressed on either side. If you were unlucky, you were assigned a spot near the bilge where water and filth pooled, soaking the canvas beneath you. In stormy weather, the ship pitched and rolled violently, and men were flung against one another like sacks of grain. The hammocks themselves were both a blessing and a curse. They kept sailors off the hard planks and helped prevent injuries when the ship rocked, but they also trapped heat and stifled air. In summer, the temperature below deck soared to unbearable levels. Men stripped down to their shirts and still lay drenched in sweat. The stink of unwashed skin, bad food, and illness pooled around them in the dark. It was common for sailors to wake in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, their lungs, straining for air that simply wasn't there. Because the watches rotated every 4 hours, there was never a moment when the quarters were empty. When one group rose to man the sails or guns, another returned to claim the vacated hammocks. This ceaseless cycle blurred day and night. For many, sleep came in ragged snatches, broken by the shouting of officers, the groan of timbers, or the shudder of cannon fire overhead. Even the act of lying down became a negotiation with fatigue and fear. In this tight press of humanity, it was entirely possible for a man to die in the night and remain undiscovered until the next watch change. Imagine the horror of reaching out to shake a shipmate awake only to find his skin cold, his body limp. There are accounts of sailors who succumbed quietly to fever, scurvy, or exhaustion. Their last moments spent wedged upright between two living bodies who were too tired or too indifferent to notice. The dead man's hammock swayed gently, as indistinguishable in the gloom as any other. Disease spread easily in these conditions. Lice infested the hammocks and clothing. Fleas carried typhus from man to man. If someone coughed blood into the darkness, it was everyone's problem. Yet there was no possibility of spacing out or isolating the sick. The ship was too small, the demands too relentless. So men learned to ignore the hacking and retching around them, to bury the knowledge that any one of them could be next. When men did fall ill, their hammocks sometimes became their burial shrouds. It was common practice to sew the deceased into the same canvas they had slept in, often with the last stitch run through the nose to be certain the man was truly dead. Then the hammock was weighted and dropped over the side, a final gesture. Of necessity, rather than respect, the cycle continued uninterrupted. The living reclaimed the space, and the darkness swallowed any trace of who had once occupied it. Despite this, sailors adapted in ways that still astonished. They developed the knack for sleeping upright, their backs braced against beams, or their knees pulled to their chests. Some claimed to find real rest this way, their bodies so exhausted. That discomfort became irrelevant. Others survived by detaching their minds, letting their thoughts drift far from the creaking hull to imagined fields and fresh air. This mental escape was perhaps the only true relief they ever knew. If you want to understand why so many sailors spoke of the sea as a kind of prison, you have only to picture this place. The cramped coffin below deck was not simply an inconvenience, it was a test of endurance that many failed. It is easy to romanticize life aboard these great ships, to admire their speed and firepower, but beneath the decks was a reality so grim that it defies simple nostalgia. Men lived cheek by jowl in a darkness that smelled of fear, disease, and the inevitability of death. Every night they closed their eyes, knowing that the darkness might be the last thing they ever sand. That if it was, no one would know until hours later. This is why those who survived spoke of the lower deck with a mixture of dread and resignation. It was the place where the human spirit was tested against limits it was never meant to endure. A place where you measured your life in inches of hammock cloth, and where the boundary between the living and the dead was sometimes as thin as a single breath. And so, when you think of the age of sail, do not forget the cramped coffin below deck, the true heart of every warship, where men surrendered their comfort, their health, and sometimes their lives in the name of duty. The dead who were thrown to the sharks in the age of sail, when voyages stretched across months in death, was an almost routine companion. The living had to find practical ways to dispose of the dead. There was no place aboard a crowded wooden ship to keep a body for long, no means to preserve it from decay in the sweltering heat of the tropics or the damp chill of the northern seas. And so, across centuries and navies, the dead were committed to the deep. This was not an act of reverence. Alone it was a necessity born of close quarters, disease, and the omnipresent threat of contagion. When a man died aboard ship, his messmates took on the final duty. The corpse was laid out on deck, the eyes closed by the calloused hands of those who had eaten, fought, and perhaps prayed alongside him. A length of canvas was brought out, a sailmaker's cloth, sometimes the man's own hammock, repurposed in death. The body was wrapped and sewn shut. With heavy twine, tradition demanded that the last stitch pass through the dead man's nose or lips, a grim confirmation that no spark of life remained. This practice was not born of superstition, but of harrowing experience. More than one sailor, presumed dead, had awoken in the suffocating darkness of a shroud. The ceremony that followed was at once solemn and hurried. Officers and crew gathered along the weather deck, the ship's bell tolled, the chaplain, or an appointed officer, recited the Lord's Prayer or the burial service from the Book of Common Prayer. All the while, the waves slapped against the hull, and the wind tugged at hats and hair. A reminder that even in death, the sea refused stillness, and beneath that restless surface, shapes moved in anticipation. Sharks were the uninvited congregation. At every burial at sea, sailors spoke of them with a mixture of dread and grim familiarity. In tropical waters especially, certain species learned to follow ships, knowing that where men sailed, the dead would eventually be surrendered. Some sharks traveled in pairs or small groups, dark fins slicing through the swells just yards from the hull. The sailors called them the ship's undertakers. They believed sharks could smell death hours before the body was committed, drawn by the scent of sickness and blood that leaked from the bilge or the surgeon's table. When the moment came, the dead man's messmates lifted the weighted Schreudoffen, with a cannonball or a bag of lead shot stitched at the feet to ensure it sank quickly. The boatswain's whistle shrilled its final note. At the captain's nod, the corpse slid from the planks into the sea with a heavy splash. In an instant, the water boiled with movement. Sharks that had hovered at a distance surged forward. Sometimes, the body disappeared below intact, a pale blur descending into blue darkness. Other times, the impact and the feeding frenzy were immediate. There are accounts recorded in logbooks and memoirs of bodies torn apart before they sank out of sight, limbs severed in sudden flashes of white belly, and rows of teeth. The sailors watched, some crossing themselves, others turning away in silent horror. To modern sensibilities, this seems almost unthinkable, a final desecration of the body. But for the men who lived and died on wooden ships, It was simply the way of things. The sea devoured everything, eventually ships, hopes, lives, and even the dead were no exception. Superstitions grew around the sharks that followed the fleet. Some believed they were spirits of drowned sailors, doomed to patrol the waves and feed upon their own kind. Others thought a shark appearing close to the hull foretold that someone aboard would soon die. Men claimed that certain sharks could recognize a ship, that they trailed a particular vessel for years, waiting patiently for the next offering. These stories were whispered in the dark between watches, fueling the dread that came when sickness spread through the crowded lower decks. Dysentery, yellow fever, scurvy, these were enemies as deadly as any cannonball. In a severe outbreak, the bodies went overboard daily. The ritual that began solemn could become grimly mechanical. The bell tolled so often that the sound seemed to merge with the creaking of the timbers and the endless sighing of the wind. Some captains attempted to maintain dignity, reading the burial service in full, even as death stalked the crew. Others shortened the rites, understanding that time was precious, that survival demanded efficiency over sentiment. For the men who remained, each burial was a reminder that they might soon be the ones sewn into canvas. It is difficult to grasp, standing on a safe shore, what it meant to live with that knowledge, to know that death was not an abstraction, but a daily companion. The ocean's vastness offered no refuge from mortality. The body of a comrade might be gone within minutes, consumed by the sea's oldest predators. And yet, life aboard continued without pause. The sails had to be trimmed, the guns swabbed, the rigging repaired. Even after a funeral, orders rang across the deck as though nothing had changed. Only at night, when the watch was set and the darkness pressed close, did men reckon with the fear that one day soon their last moment might come not in battle, but in the quiet oblivion of a weighted shroud sliding into the depths. The dead who were thrown to the sharks were not extraordinary in their fate. They were sailors, like thousands of others poor, often illiterate, sometimes pressed into service against their will. Their names have been largely lost to history, their deaths recorded in a few spare lines of logbook entries that noted the date, the hour, the direction of the wind. But if we look closer, past the dry catalog of losses, we see a truth as vast as the sea itself, that in the end, all men aboard a ship became part of the same story, bound together by shared labor, shared fear, and the knowledge that the ocean would one day claim them all. In that final surrender to the waves, the dead were both honored and consumed, their bodies serving a purpose even in death, sustaining the creatures that trailed the ship from horizon to horizon. For the living, it was a reminder that nothing aboard a sailing vessel could be wasted, not a scrap of cloth, not a drop of fresh water, not even the flesh and bone of a fallen shipmate. In the logbooks, the entries are sparse, almost indifferent. Buried at sea, body taken by sharks. But those simple words conceal an intensity of experience that is almost unimaginable now, a world where men toiled and died far from any land. Their final resting place, an ocean that never gave back what it claimed. The fire that started in the powder room, picture the dim belly of a wooden warship, anchored and seemingly safe. It's the late afternoon of an ordinary day, when maintenance should have been a mundane ritual. The air below deck was heavy, with damp rope, oil, and the faint, ever-present temps of salt. In the powder room, a cramped chamber deep inside the ship's hull barrels lined the walls in orderly stacks, filled with finely ground black powder. A single stray spark in this place was enough to unmake an entire ship. And yet in that era, with all the caution sailors tried to muster, accidents still found their way into every crevice. It happened as simply as you'd expect. A sailor paused to light a pipe. Perhaps it was habit, the comfort of a little smoke after hours of heaving supplies up and down ladders. Perhaps he didn't think through the consequences. The spark that fell from the glowing bowl of tobacco drifted unnoticed in the air, dancing its brief arc before it landed amid the grains of black powder scattered on the planks. In an instant, faster than any shout or warning, the room turned into an inferno. Black powder doesn't explode all at once like modern explosives. It burns fast enough to shatter timbers and rip flesh apart in a heartbeat. Witnesses later described a dull, concussive thud, followed by a blast of fire that roared through the seams of the deck above. Heavy oak hatches lifted into the air as if they weighed nothing. Men who were standing on the deck directly above The powder room were hurled skyward, flung like rag dolls into the rigging or over the rails into the harbor. The worst of it, though, was down below. Sailors working nearby had no time to escape. The shockwave turned barrels into splinters and bodies into shattered wreckage. Those who were not killed outright were left crawling through flame and choking smoke, their uniforms burning, skin seared and peeling. The darkness of that hold was suddenly blindingly bright, then plunged back into blackness as the flames consumed the oxygen. Survivors on the upper decks rushed to the hatches, prying them open with poles and hooks, only to be met by the stench of burned flesh and scorched powder. They could hear cries from men still alive in that coffin of fire voices breaking into sobs as the heat and smoke overtook them. Some tried to go down ladders to drag their shipmates out, but the heat was so intense it blistered their faces and hands before they were halfway inside. One account describes how a bosun tried 3 times to descend into the powder room, each time retreating with his hair singed and tears boiling in his eyes. The explosion did not completely destroy the hull, but the damage was devastating. Bulkheads buckled, beams split. In a few seconds, the ship was transformed from a proud instrument of war into a burned-out carcass. Sailors and dockworkers alike gathered around, helpless, listening as the cries faded into a terrible hush. Only after the wreck cooled could they enter to carry out the bodice most charred so badly they could not be recognized. They were laid out side by side on the quay, and men were called forward to identify them by the shape of a ring, a scrap of cloth, or the memory of where each had been working. It is easy to read such an event as a cautionary tale, one more lesson about the dangers of negligence. But in truth, Tudor ships were floating powder kegs by design. Powder rooms were lined with copper sheeting to reduce sparks, but perfect safety was impossible. Ships carried thousands of pounds of powder in barrels and canvas cartridges. Lanterns had to be shielded by horn or glass. Even the nails in sailors' boots could strike sparks if they scraped the floor the wrong way. In the chaos of constant maintenance, battle drills, and cramped quarters, it was only a matter of time before an accident ignited the inevitable. The fire that started in the powder room was not unique. Throughout the Tudor period, similar catastrophes struck fleets across Europe. A single ember, an unguarded flame, or the careless handling of a slow match could trigger destruction on a scale no cannon could rival. What makes this incident so haunting is the immediacy of it, a moment of routine. Work turned instantly into an unstoppable catastrophe. The stories of the men who survived are full of stunned disbelief. Some said the blast lifted them clear off their feet and threw them against bulkheads. Others awoke lying in darkness, unsure if they were alive or dead, feeling the heat radiate. Through the wreckage, sailors groped their way out by touch, their eyes burned blind by smoke. Those who emerged alive bore the scars for the rest of their lives, mangled limbs, pitted skin, memories that never loosened their hold. In the aftermath, investigations tried to fix blame. They demanded to know whose hand had carried the spark, whose negligence had condemned dozens of men to the flames. But the deeper truth was harder to accept. Every Tudor warship carried the seeds of its own destruction, packed neatly in barrels, waiting for that one unlucky moment. The survivors would recall not only the noise and the flame, silence afterward, when the cries were gone and the ship itself seemed to sink into a stunned quiet. Even centuries later, when we look back at the grandeur of naval warfare in the Age of Sail, we must remember this darker side. Below the decks where men sang shanties, loaded cannon, and dreamed of glory, there was always that hidden chambera, space where one spark could obliterate everything. The fire that started in the powder room was not just a disaster. It was a reminder that the most destructive forces aboard a Tudor warship were not always the enemy's guns, but the simplest moments of human carelessness. The captain, who was worshipped like a god, picture a Tudor warship gliding across a gray and endless sea. Her sails swollen with wind that smelled of brine and the cold promise of distant coasts. Beneath those towering masts, Lived, crammed into a floating world of strict hierarchy and unrelenting discipline. At the apex of this world stood the captain, a figure so powerful that his authority surpassed law itself. His word was absolute. His displeasure could end a man's life in the space between two heartbeats. To defy him was to defy the will of the ship, the crown, and in some eyes, God himself. This was no abstraction. It was a daily truth that every sailor understood in his bones, a fact that hung over every watch, every order, every moment of silence before a storm. The captain's power rested on centuries of naval custom and an unspoken doctrine of divine right. While the monarch ruled the land, the captain ruled the ship utterly and without recourse. The Articles of War, those grim statutes nailed to the mainmast, spelled out penalties for theft, mutiny, and cowardice. But many offenses were judged not by a jury or a tribunal, but by the captain alone. Even the smallest breaches of decorum could provoke fury, and in this world of iron discipline, the mere act of failing to salute fast enough could become a death sentence. One particular captain, whose name survives in hushed fragments of record, had grown notorious for treating any perceived disrespect as heresy. He had served for decades, weathered storms that snapped masts like twigs and battles that left the decks ankle-deep in blood. Some said these ordeals had unmoored his sense of proportion, convincing him that only absolute terror could maintain order. Others believed that a taste of unchecked power had awakened something darker. Whatever the cause, this captain had developed a ritual of command that blended ceremony with cruelty. Each morning, the men were made to assemble in rows along the deck, hats in hand, eyes fixed on the planking at their feet. No one dared speak. No one dared breathe too loudly. When the captain emerged from his cabin, resplendent in a cloak lined with velvet and a sword polished until it gleamed like a shard of the sun, the crew bowed so low that their spines ached. On the day that would pass into legend, one sailor young, exhausted from a night hauling ropes in a squall failed to snap to salute with the proper speed. His hand moved, but not fast enough to satisfy the captain's hunger for obedience. The moment stretched into a frozen tableau, the entire deck holding its breath. Then the captain raised one gloved hand. That gesture alone was enough to seal the man's fate. Without a trial, without a word of defense, the sentence was pronounced death. Some men whispered that the captain's face never even changed expression. As he gave the order, a blade was brought, and in full view of the assembled crew, the sailor's life was ended as swiftly as a sheep at slaughter. It is easy to recoil from this as the act of a madman. But to the Tudor Navy, such executions were not entirely beyond imagining. Discipline was the bedrock on which survival rested. A ship was a fragile machine of wood and sail, requiring perfect coordination to resist the fury of cannon and storm, to challenge authority, no matter how petty the offense was, to invite chaos. Captains wielded this fear like a weapon, understanding that terror could achieve what no chain or lock ever could: total submission. Yet there was something different about this captain, something that transcended even the normal brutality of maritime life. To his men, he became an object of worship as much as fear. The ceremony of his appearances, the way no one could look directly at him without trembling, the knowledge that his mood could end or spare a life, these things combined to create an aura of divinity. Sailors would bow their heads when he passed, as though in church. They would whisper prayers that he might never single them out for his cold scrutiny. In private, some claimed he could predict the weather or sense mutiny before it bloomed. This superstition fed the power he held, until even the officers treated him as something more than mortal. Historical accounts tell us that life aboard Tudor warships was already a form of voluntary imprisonment. Food was a stew of salted meat and weevilled biscuit. Fresh water went foul after weeks at sea. Sickness spread in the darkness below decks. But above all, this hardship loomed the captain's presence, the knowledge that he alone could define what constituted respect or insubordination. It was not merely a question of saluting quickly enough, but of performing every act with the conviction that he watched, that he judged. The psychological burden was immense. Men began to rehearse their gestures in private, practicing how fast to move their hands to avoid suspicion. Some feigned illnesses to remain below decks and out of his sight. Others turned to drink or to whispered mutiny that never found the courage to become action. This power, unchecked by any court or admiralty review, had a corrosive effect on the ship's morale. A single execution, especially for so slight an offense, shattered any illusion of fairness. Trust eroded. Comrades who once shared crusts of bread and fellowship began to fear each other's gaze. A careless word, a moment of fatigue, could be reported to the captain, and if he chose, He could condemn without justification, for no man ranked above him while the ship sailed. Even in death, the executed sailor's body became part of the captain's theater. Some captains ordered the corpse displayed on deck for hours as a warning, the face covered by a scrap of sailcloth. Others consigned the dead to the sea immediately, but made a public spectacle of the final rites. The point was always the same, to remind every witness that the line between life and oblivion was drawn by a single hand. Over time, this legend grew. Sailors passing down the story claimed that the captain never once showed regret, that he slept soundly, untroubled by dreams of the men he'd killed. Some said he believed himself chosen by God to impose order, that he had become so entwined with his authority that he no longer recognized any distinction between his will and divine law. In the lore of the lower decks, he became something monstrous, a living embodiment of the ship's merciless power. And yet, to the navy that sustained England's ambitions, he was tolerated, perhaps even respected. For in an age when a single mutiny could doom an entire squadron, there was a cold logic in making an example so absolute that no man dared defy it. The empire was built on such terrors, on the capacity to bend men to an iron will, to extinguish individuality until only obedience remained. When we look back on these captains, it is tempting to imagine them as aberrations, rare tyrants, whose cruelty was out of place. But the uncomfortable truth is that they were products of their age. The Tudor Navy believed that hierarchy and discipline were the only barriers between civilization and anarchy. In that cramped world of tar and cannon, smoke, a captain could become a god damned to fail in homage, even by a heartbeat, was to risk sacrifice.